Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the next round of Art in Focus, our monthly series where first in the Bellarmine Hall Galleries here at Fairfield University, we sit in a very casual way in front of a work of art and have an informal discussion. And then I pop online here for our live stream viewers, and then we pop it on YouTube after the fact so everyone can continue enjoying the conversation. If this is your first time tuning in to an Art in Focus, you are more than welcome to use the chat box you're seeing on the Quick Live at any time. Drop in any observation, any question that you have. It's so much more fun for me when this is a true conversation, but I also benefit from the awesome experience we just had together in the gallery with a pretty large group. I was just remarking to our producer that Rembrandt is a crowd pleaser, right? People know his name, they want to know more about him. And before I say anything else, I will mention that on Tuesday evening, if you are watching this live, not recorded, on Tuesday evening, November 19th, so next week at 5 p.m., in the campus center here at Fairfield in the Dogwood Room. We are so excited that the curator in charge of European prints and drawings from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Dr. Nadine Orenstein, is coming to give a talk on Rembrandt. So if you are a Rembrandt fan, please join us at 5 o'clock on Tuesday. If you are a distant viewer and want to watch live, you can tune in. It will be hosted on the quicklive.com, quicklive.org. I think I said the wrong thing. Anyway, it'll be here in the same location you're finding this talk at 5 o'clock. Her specific focus is going to be the business of buying, selling, and making prints in Rembrandt's time. So especially for those of you who might be interested in the nuts and bolts of how did objects like the Three Trees, or indeed any of his other prints, how were they made, distributed, what kind of networks do they rely on? You will learn so much from Dr. Orenstein's talk, so I hope you can join us. If you have not been able to come to Fairfield, and I should mention, our producer is going to pop the registration link for Tuesday night into the chat if you want to hold on to that as a reminder. She will also put in a link to the exhibition landing page for the show Ink and Time, European Prints from the Wetmore Collection. This has been the subject of several of our Art in Focus events this fall, as it's been one of our 2 print shows here at the Fairfield University Art Museum, on view through December 21st. So if you are in this area, we're open Tuesday through Saturday from 11 a.m. to 4 p.m. And on Thursdays, we're open until 8 p.m. So you're looking at one end of the Bellarmine Hall Galleries, our Rembrandt wall, so to speak. But I also have this image from opening night, and a few people gathered around the subject of our discussion. So imagine half an hour ago, this was us, but we were seated on fairly uncomfortable stools in front of Rembrandt's Three Trees instead of standing and joined around it, giving you a little bit of a sense of scale. So this is probably one of Rembrandt's most recognizable prints, and definitely his most recognizable landscape. It is the largest of the landscapes that he produced in printmaking form. And it's from the year 1643, which if you are a Rembrandt fan or familiar with anything about the life of this great Dutch artist, know that in 1 year previous, 1642, was the year he painted the Night Watch. That is by far Rembrandt's most famous painting. It's in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. It's currently undergoing a quite long and publicly conducted program of conservation it's called Operation Night Watch. You can look that up. But all of that to suggest that at the time that Rembrandt takes his tools to his copper plate to create the Three Trees, he's riding high. He's at the apex of his success and popularity. His paintings and prints are sought after, and he is a little bit distant from some of the tragedies and misfortunes that will befall him a little bit later in his career. One of the things we just talked about together in the gallery, well, we talked about a lot of things. One of the things that came up was, as we look at this, there is a remarkable sense of tranquility on the one hand, even though there seems to be perhaps a contrasting sense of potential instability or future instability. And we discussed that indeed, it can be very restorative, calming to sit and look at artwork, no matter the style. It doesn't have to be Rembrandt, doesn't have to be a print, something that will just take you somewhere else. And I think Rembrandt can do that very effectively. This is a particularly wide-ranging print because he's given us so much depth to explore our way into. So many things potentially to move around this relatively small, I'm going to show you the scale size again. It's not that big. I mean, he has much smaller ones. There's a 2-inch square self-portrait over there to the left that you're hidden behind one of our guests. But it's not big, yet there's so much for our eyes to feast on. And as a bit of historical context, I did ask the members of our group who were with us in the gallery who amongst them had visited the Netherlands, which unfortunately I never have. So I only know this in a scholarly sense, but she said, oh yeah, the Netherlands, oh, it's flat. The land is flat. And if you've ever seen a Dutch landscape painting or indeed another print where the flat lands of fields and farms and sometimes their bleaching white cloths are stretching far and away to the distance, you know that this is something of a repeating motif in Dutch art. They are enamored of their landscape. They have a flat one that allows you to see so far into the distance if you have a little bit of elevation. And indeed, it takes some very close investigation along the horizon line to discern a windmill, the shape of buildings. It's clearly not necessarily where our eyes are intended to go off there in the distance. We don't really have a sense of exactly how far away that could be, but it could be a distance of miles for all we know. And between that distant horizon line and us, we see evidence of farming. We see small human figures. And then closer to us on the right, this little crop of land. It's probably an artificial dike. So one of the earthworks the Dutch developed to help control their physical environment, always under threat from potential entrance of water. And on that cropping of land, we have these 3 trees standing up. And then we have everything that's happening in the sky. So if you really think about how much land, as I've been talking about, horizon line down, really only occupies maybe the bottom third of this entire composition. Yes, the trees are thrusting upward, but so much of this, as with so many other Dutch artists, is sky and weather and changing environment. And one of our observers had noted that it's incredible what, and this applies to any artist in printmaking, it's wild what you can do even in the absence of color. Because I had asked, what do we think of when we think of Rembrandt, sort of as an opening conversation starter? And of course, people said self-portraits. And you might also extend that to the way that Rembrandt likes to pile paint on and his very gestural brushstrokes, really fun to look at up close. And perhaps the color palette is a little bit more muted than, let's say, an Italian Renaissance painting with all their silks and satins. But it's incredibly rich and incredibly subtle use of color. And yeah, we know Rembrandt loves his darkness. His face is sort of swimming out of darkness. But usually in his paintings, he's got color in his arsenal. And he doesn't have that in his prints. But his fascination with evoking the tonality of light and shadow, especially when it's in wild variations, as we might find in a landscape looking off into the distance, where it really does seem that something is either about to happen in terms of weather or perhaps has just happened. So if you have any observations or suggestions on whether we are looking at something that is in the before or in the after, I am excited to hear them. In fact, I'm going to look at some detail images as we sort of gather our thoughts as we move around this particular object. Those of you who are fans of printmaking will know that Rembrandt loved to experiment with, by the 17th century, all the means of printmaking at his disposal, which meant that he knew how to engrave. That had been the more common way of making prints in the century prior, which had itself in turn replaced relief printmaking like woodcuts. And engraving, as you may know, makes a nice, strong, deep line with the burin, your carving tool, moving across your copper plate. I like to tell my students that it makes a line that's a very nice, clean V, like this. Of course, engraving has some drawbacks to it. If you are engraving, you have to hold your plate and your tool, and you tend to be moving the plate more than the tool itself. The tool stays at a very shallow angle to the plate. It's not really a natural way to move the tool. So even though the benefit of engraving to artists was that they were directly incising their design into the plate, as opposed to carving a woodcut, the drawbacks were you weren't really able to move your hand very fluidly. So you had to have, be trained to make engraving marks. The technique that comes along later in the 16th century and really takes prominence in Rembrandt's golden age of of Dutch art is etching and its friend drypoint. So etching, and I've zoomed in on an area of the sky here that I was suggesting to our guest, even if you do not fancy yourself an artist, which I certainly do not, I could do some of this. You give me a little pencil, I could make some of these little curly Q squiggly cloud edges. I could do some parallels, a little bit of hatching. It wouldn't be anything fancy, but I could reproduce that. But what we're seeing, I'm joking, of course, like Rembrandt's got a lot more skill and training than I've got. But we're seeing an element almost of the doodle, almost of the sketch. This is the appeal that etching will bring to artists. With this new technique and the better living through chemistry, they can take a sharp tool we call an etcher's needle, and they can just draw on the surface of a copper plate. No more being tied to the burin and driving it through the copper. Instead, take your sharp tool and you can just move your hand any way you'd like. Now, granted, for this to be an etching, we will have had to take some very careful preparatory steps. We will have had to cover the surface of our copper plate in a waxy material called ground, something that resists acid. And as we make our little doodles, our little sketch, everywhere the tool is applied, you are just gently scratching through that protective layer, that ground layer. And when we're done with whatever design we wanted to scratch on, like these atmospheric areas of cloud, when we put our plate into the acid bath, could be hydrochloric acid, sulfuric acid, when we put it in there, just 15, 20 seconds maybe to start, the acid can only affect the areas of the plate where you've scratched through that protection. So printmakers will say that the acid will bite the design into the metal plate. So where before you were doing some of the work to remove the metal, now you're letting the acid just dissolve the metal away. So in contrast to the nice sharp V of an engraved line, got a bit of a softer line when you're doing it with etching. And if you know anything about Rembrandt, you will know he was nothing if not an experimenter. And he's not the first artist to invent these techniques, but he's going to try them in as many combinations as he can. For example, maybe he is working on these little bushes that are behind some of the three trees. He's got the contour lines, but clearly some of these bushes are in full sun and some of them are in shadow. One of the ways that Rembrandt could achieve a deeper, thicker etched line that would hold more ink and print darker might be to send the plate back into the acid bath a second time. But he would have to be very clear-minded about what he wants. Because if you just you pull your plate out of the acid, you look at it, if you ran a test printing, if you sent the exact same plate back in, you're going to get every one of your lines etched more deeply. That is, unless you decide to cover up some of the areas of your design. If you say, I've etched this area of the bush, I've gotten the lines into the plate, I don't want it to go any further. I'm going to recover those lines with a little bit of that ground. In a modern printmaker studio, you can actually use a Sharpie, which was news to me when I saw that done. Then if you leave some of the areas exposed, put it back into the acid bath for a double bite, as it's called, those lines will just get deeper and fuller and rounder. So you can control, as the artist, you want to leave some a little more faint, a little more light. You want some a little bit more deeply. And then imagine if you really want to increase the depth after you're done etching, after acid is over, you've cleaned the ground off your plate, you could also go back in with the engraving tool and really dig in some nice, deep, strong lines. Of course, you can't go back to etching after that point, right? Once acid is involved, you've got to be very controlled and conscious of what you're doing. But we know that Rembrandt would both do his etching, he would add some deep engraved lines. And I'll say this is an area where even close looking will not always, to the untrained eye, reveal to you, is this line truly an etched line? Is it an engraved line? Drypoint, we'll come back to in a moment. If you looked at a print under really high-powered magnification, one of the things they will be able to look at is, are the edges of it softer and rounder, suggesting etching, or are they the sharp, clean lines of an engraved line? And of course, people like Dr. Orenstein, who are print scholars, they will have an eye that is so much more attuned to the fine details of these prints than myself, who's coming to it as someone who has appreciated having the opportunity to look at this print many times a day for the past few months. But this has not been my career and my area of focus. So I, as you can tell, am very much looking forward to hearing to hearing her talk. I will say that there's a limit to what the copper plate can take when you're doing etching. And the figure of the fisherman at the lower left of the composition here is often referred to by print scholars to point out that his lines have been double bitten, and they're approaching a point where if they were exposed to acid any further, they would start to just collapse into each other. Because you imagine you have to maintain some cohesion of the plate. You can't have everything be something that holds ink, otherwise you'll print a blotchy black mess. So there's this fine balance the printmakers have to find. You want things to go deeper and be stronger, but you can't risk having your lines collapse either. I will admit to you that I find it challenging to really conceptualize this, but I'm going to point out to you what was shared with me with a print scholar at the Minneapolis Institute of Art. I was doing a program there 2 summers ago. We were looking at a really nice impression of the 3 trees in their print study room. And he was pointing out something about the farmland in sort of the middle ground behind this gentleman, who's the fisherman. We see some cows. There's another guy standing back there. And he said that print scholars have determined that Rembrandt really determined to get the maximum tonality out of his plates. Seems to have been experimenting with something they describe as a sulfur bite. If you've ever heard of the term aqua tinting, this has not been invented in 1643. It will come. In fact, our next Art in Focus will have a print that involves aqua tint. So Rembrandt is, before this technique's been invented, he's got acid. Now, on the one hand, he's used it for acid solution to etch designs into the plate. That's done, that's over, the plate surface is clean. What scholars think he might have been experimenting with in that area of the plate was just taking that acid and somehow flicking tiny droplets onto the bare plate, which of course, being acid, would kind of make little inconsistencies, little irregularities in the surface that might just hold a little more ink in a more diffuse pattern than a line. So, as I say, I have really struggled looking at that area and really discerning. For me, it's the cow. I get a sense of a bit of gray tonality that is not just the lines themselves, but far wiser scholars than I assure us that Rembrandt is doing something there. That is a reminder that he has a very fertile mind and he's always looking for some new way to get his visual point across. This area of the print, lower right, is almost, it's very dark. There is, if you believe me, if you want to take my word for it, there are a pair of lovers hidden in the lower right. And I will quote one of our visitors just a few moments ago. Joe said, hanky-panky. Indeed. But truly, the 3 trees has everything going on it. It has nature, it has farming, it has people, a city in the distance, and a pair of lovers sort of tucked away in a bower at the lower right. I will not blame you if you struggle to find where those lovers actually are, which partially is a result of the condition that this particular print is in, which I'll come back to in just one second. I want to go back to the full image so we can really take a look at that sky, which, as I mentioned, could be storm that's about to happen. You could interpret it as a storm that is passing in the other direction. Clearly, the fisherman at the lower left doesn't seem to be bothered by a sense of turbulence coming his way. And there's another person sitting next to him. We can see at the upper left, there are very clear lines that have evidently been done with a straight edge. So don't make yourself feel bad if you don't think you could draw a perfectly straight line like that. Even Rembrandt is using, well, not a ruler, but he's using something with a straight edge. And we discussed, are those driving lines of rain coming down? Could we interpret them as shafts of sunlight, which would almost be sort of the perverse opposite since they're clearly black lines, but some folks said they saw those as shafts of light coming through. And we might even be able to make out in sort of the center area of the sky, almost what seems to be a figure. See if you can find something that looks a little bit winged. And if you can find the wings and you can find the area where there might be a head, maybe you follow that down and it seems like it could be a body. And in fact, it seems that Rembrandt reused this plate for a design of Tobias and the Angel, which he did on another plate at a different time. And clearly he decided that the sort of vaporous outlines of the angel would work just fine for this tumultuous environment that he's creating, because he could have removed them from the surface of the plate. Etched lines are not quite as deep as those of engraving. If you have a burnishing tool, which is sort of, I crook my finger like this, but I flipped it upside down, and I had that tool in metal, you could, with a lot of exertion, rub that. Actually, I guess it's easier to do with your thumb. Imagine this of metal, and if you rub some of those delicate lines and you work at it, you will polish them off the surface of the plate. Effectively, you are erasing them. A lot harder to do with engraving, but this is another reason that etching is appealing to someone like Rembrandt, who's always thinking, always changing. So from that, we might conclude that if he really wanted to, he could have removed more of the contours of that angel, but I think he just decided, that's fine, it works. The three trees, one of our guests had said, well, the focal point is the trees. And I said, no, tell me more about how does he make it the focal point? Because we might think that in the past, an artist would tell you what to look at by putting it dead center. He's not going to take that kind of shortcut, right? It's off to the side. And she said, well, it's the contrast, the darkness of the trees, and then the light behind them. So you don't have to look there, but they are the only large sort of vertical element on that half of the print. They have this great contrast behind them. And as you look and as you notice the way that the trees might be interacting with the wind that's coming at them, they seem to be lifted. When I say the more you look at this print, it might seem very simple. Oh, it's a landscape with three trees. Nothing important happening here. But you could also look at it for a long time and just really immerse yourself in the imagined environment that Rembrandt is creating. I also want to point out that was highlighted by one of our visitors. Nope, you can't see it in this one. I'll have to go further off to the... No, I can't see it. Well, that's a bummer. So I was blowing it up. I had an iPad in the gallery, so I can actually blow things up even larger if we need to, if we can't see something with the magnifying glasses. We're looking behind the trees, and I'll just point out here, do you see the little wagon? This is, with the etching needle. We've got people in a wagon drawn by a horse. There might be a person walking behind them. If I go back to the main view of the three trees, look further off to the right, but following that contour line of the hill. And one of our visitors asked, what is that guy doing? So it was so hard to see even on the print itself. So we'd blown it up on the iPad, and it's very clearly once you look at it very closely, it's a guy with a hat, and he's sitting plopped on the ground. His legs are out in front of him, heading toward the right edge of the composition. And he said he's just in the moment. He's just sitting there. He could be having a picnic. He's clearly not looking at the turbulence behind him. He's looking onward to a brighter future, or he's just letting the sun warm his face. It's just one of those details that I honestly had not really noticed that figure before until someone else pointed it out to me. So that is the joy of looking together at artwork sometimes, that other people will see things that you just don't. I realize I had not mentioned, by the way, the third technique that Rembrandt is making use of in making this and many of his other prints, and that is called drypoint. So drypoint happens, again, after the etching process is over. You have etched some lines using acid. You might have engraved some to add some darkness into areas where you want it. Drypoint uses the same etching needle as the etching process, and all you're doing is making the same little drawing lines, little sketchy lines, anywhere you like. But now the plate is not protected by ground. You're not going to apply acid again. What you are looking to do, though, as you move your etching tool through the copper, you're letting the little tiny curlicues of metal that come up, you're letting them stay. So in engraving, you are, a printmaker that I did that workshop with in Minneapolis had said it this way: if engraving removes metal and etching dissolves metal, drypoint displaces metal. So you're just moving the metal to the side. You're not cutting it off with the scraper like you would in engraving. You're not letting the acid bath take care of it. You're just moving it to one side. And you're going to take advantage of the fact that when that burr, as we call it, when you ink your plate, the burr is able to hold on to a little bit more ink than just the line itself that you scratched in. And when you run it through the press, it's going to give you a more velvety darkness than the line alone. So Rembrandt realizes that, and he is going to make ample use of it Because what does he want? He wants contrast of light and inky darkness, the way he does in his paintings. You might also have heard the phrase plate tone with regard to Rembrandt. Another little innovation or a little area of experimentation. When you go to print a copper plate, whether you have done engraving, etching, or dry point, anything where you've made marks in the copper plate, the printing process is pretty much the same. You take your plate, you cover the whole thing with ink. Then you take a cloth called a tarlatan and you start buffing the ink away. Your goal, ultimately, is to make sure that your copper plate looks really clean. The only ink is in the lines that you have caused to be imprinted into the plate. And that can mean that you are really standing there for 10 minutes with successively cleaner and cleaner tarlatans, and maybe at the end just using the edge of your hand to wipe it away. Because there were certainly artists who would want any area that they had not marked up the plate with a line, they wanted it to print nice and clean and pure. And if you didn't do that, if you didn't get all of the extra ink off, when you printed it, you'd wind up with something we call plate tone, a little bit of grayish tonality from the extra particles of ink you left on the plate. You could look at that as a failure. You could be Rembrandt and think, maybe this is another way. If I want to get extra subtlety and gradations of light and shadow, maybe I leave a little extra ink on there in some of the impressions. It's just the incredible amount of ability for Rembrandt to experiment is extraordinary. Oh, Lyle commented that dry point needles are different from etching needles in general. Thank you for telling me that. The only way I've seen it done and been shown to do it is with the same tool, but I am not a master printmaker by any stretch of the imagination. So if you have more experience, I'm happy to defer to that. The principle, I guess, is there. The question would be the fineness of your tool. All of that to say, here we have the impression of the three trees, 1643, that is in our exhibition currently on view at Fairfield. Where did it come from? I mentioned it's part of the show that we have that came from the Wetmore Collection at Connecticut College. All of those prints, or almost all of them, were owned by a fairly mysterious collector named Fanny S. Wetmore. And I say mysterious because we don't even know securely the dates of her life and death, only that she amassed this collection of prints, which was particularly strong in prints by Albert Dürer and Rembrandt, and then donated them to Connecticut College in 1930. For individual prints, there are some notices of the print dealers in New York where she bought them from, occasionally the price that she paid, but really not a lot of information about what was driving her as a collector. Clearly, she liked Rembrandt prints. Because we don't know a lot about her, we don't know about, what was her background, what was her experience with prints. We don't know where she got her money from. I mean, we can assume she's an art collector around the turn of the century, living in New York. She certainly had some money, but it doesn't seem that she was a collector, let's say, at the level of JP Morgan. And unsurprisingly, the impressions that she is purchasing are not always the finest ones. She's buying what is available to her on the market and is within her price range at that time. So if we compare, for example, Three Trees on the left is the one that is on view here at Fairfield. The two others that I've added on screen, one belongs to the Princeton University Art Museum, one belongs to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. You might be able to see even at this distance, and I did choose purposely to put three together as opposed to having two where you'd see them more up close, because I think it's interesting to get the sense of that the difference is multiplied by seeing it in more than just a one-on-one comparison. Both of the prints at the right have a different sort of tonality to the paper, which of course we have to think about the digital images that I'm using, any changes that might have been made there. We have to wonder about conservation status. We have to think about, do we know what kind of paper each of these is printed on? All of those questions, absolutely true. But if we look, for example, just at the area where the bank of land underneath the three trees, where it meets the water, look at the two on the right. Notice how sort of deep and, I don't want to say uncompromising, but how velvety the shadows are. Compare it to the same area in the Wetmore impression. Oops, went forward. The same area in the Wetmore impression, there's just a lot more light. There's a lot more white areas that are visible. One adjective that a guest just shared, she said it looks grainier in the Wetmore edition. Similarly, if we look at the area in the sky that is around of the angel figure and off into the left, there's sort of a soft and dusky tonality that is present in the two impressions at the right, and it's not quite there in the one on the left. This is the kind of subtle distinction in appearance, in quality, that a true connoisseur of prints will know, will recognize, and frankly, they will be salivating over. But on a broader sense, it is incredible the power of technology that has allowed me, sitting here in this, the director's office in Fairfield, to bring together three objects, one Fairfield, Connecticut, one in Princeton, New Jersey, one in New York, get those images on a screen and say, but of course the impressions belonging to Princeton and the Met, see how fine they are. When I imagine myself being Fanny Wetmore, being a collector, a woman collector in New York around 1900, consider, what is she using for visual comparanda? How many other impressions of the three trees does she have visual access to? Has she been to the Metropolitan? Did they yet, by the way, own the impression at the right, which you see was donated as a bequest in 1929? I mean, for all I know, maybe she's friends with the Havermeyers and she's seen that impression at their home. I'm literally just spinning tales here. But I'm just inviting us to consider, in the past, if you were a collector, how did you get familiar with these objects? We have a lot of wonderful opportunities by technology to compare far-flung objects around the world. Museums that are particularly well appointed in print collections will often have multiple impressions of the same object. It might seem to the outsider like, why do they have more than one of the same? For the reason you see. When we know something was made in multiples, we want to look at as many of them as possible so we begin to understand, is there a difference in closeness to the artist's vision that might be represented by some impressions more than another? And I think in looking at these three on screen, knowing what we know about Rembrandt's love of gradations, of subtlety, I think it's pretty clear that the two prints on the right more closely approximate what he was going for than the one that Ms. Wetmore was able to acquire. And yet, who can't recognize the canonical three trees from all of these, right? That is the wonder of prints. They are both many and they are one in our imagination kind of at the same time. I was wondering to myself, why did I bring this print? Why did I bring this photo back at the end? I was thinking, it was like, I like the sense of community that it suggests, that looking together at artworks, even if the skies are troubled inside the Rembrandt print, at the same time, we can find a lot of peace and calm in looking at them, which some of us may be feeling that we particularly need at this moment in time. I also wanted to highlight something which I am forgetting, so you can tell that I'm searching for it in my mind as I think of it. Well, I guess it'll come to me. It has come to me. I put the slide in there because I was thinking about community and this sort of group of ladies looking at this print on opening night. But I wanted to share something that one of our guests, Pat, had said during the session that we just had, which I totally understand. She's come to several art and focus events focused around the show. We looked at a woodcut, we looked at an engraving. Now we've looked at an etching with bits of engraving and dry point. And she's like, I've spent so many hours in museums. I love museums, I love art. And I am never drawn to the prints when I go into a museum. And she was saying it in terms of, she is now eager to go back to a museum and think about them in a new way, maybe with a slightly more detailed understanding of the immense amount of creativity and ingenuity that goes into their production. But I asked the group, I said, raise your hand if you're not drawn to the print gallery when you go to the Metropolitan or the MFA or any other museum. And I put my hand up. I love color. I can't help that. So I said, I empathize. And at the same time, I also have really benefited from a show like this one. Getting to spend time with artworks like these really does give you a renewed appreciation of what can be done, sometimes in very small areas. As I mentioned, there's a self-portrait by Rembrandt hiding behind Lydia's head there. It's 2 inches by 2 inches. It's tiny, and yet so expressive, so incredible. This from the artist who a year before the three trees had done the massive painting of the Night Watch. I mean, it just really boggles the mind, the amount of creativity that he was able to display. So I hope whether you're looking at this virtually or you've come to the museum in person, that this might for you as well spark some of that interest to give prints another look when you are in a museum. And yet at the same time, I was mentioning to our guests, any museum you go to, there will be fewer prints on view, and they will not be on view permanently. So I think one of the ways that for the common museum visitor, if you're like me, you might go to a favorite museum and you've got a few favorite pieces that you're really looking forward to seeing again. That sculpture is always there. This painting is usually in this gallery. Then if it's the Met, they rehang the European galleries. You got to find your friends again. But often with artworks like sculpture, like painting, we look forward to seeing them again. Prints, because of their physical nature, because they are works on paper, because they're sensitive to light, they can't be exposed for years and years on end. They have to be rotated, they have to be allowed to rest. So that's just one reason why when you go to a museum that has a print room, they're changing out those exhibitions really frequently. So on the one hand, it doesn't let us build that, year after year, necessarily expecting to find the same impression of the three trees on view each time. But it could encourage you to just find what new surprises and what new friends might be waiting for you if you pop into the print room at the museum the next time you go. Lyle comments, as a printmaker, I always seek out the prints. I agree they are not always on display due to fragility. Well, a printmaker will, of course, be drawn to the prints. The person who did her PhD in Italian Renaissance painting, I'm going to go to the paintings gallery first. But we can all always be excited and surprised by new visual feasts that we find in any museum that we visit. So we, once again, are so fortunate to have the benefit of having the Wetmore Collection on view here at Fairfield. It's here through December 21st. As I mentioned before, Nadine Orenstein, curator of European Prints and Drawings from the Metropolitan, will be speaking here on campus at 5 p.m. on Tuesday. It'll also be live streamed. So if you'd like to watch it, you can tune in then. And I hope you'll join me again. We'll be looking at one more print from the Wetmore Collection in December. It'll be a print by a woman artist, which I'm very excited about, an allegorical reproductive print. There'll be some aquatint and there will be some gold. So we're going to find that color, actually, ironically, despite what I've just said. So thank you all for joining me, and I hope to see you at another Art in Focus event soon. Have a great day, everyone.